Hi, welcome. We're so glad that you're here again with us on Tuesday for Happy Half Hour. And here's to you. Here's a toast. I hope you will enjoy this time. Tonight, we're really going to talk about children's television, and I'm very excited about that. But let me first start this out with yes, those are the NBC chimes, just one of the many wonderful, wonderful articles that we have at the Museum of Broadcast Communication. I'm Susie Schultz. I'm the executive director, and we're so happy to be able to bring you a little bit of museum's history and all of the things that we are doing online to you on Tuesday evenings. So, welcome. I want you to know a little bit about some of the things that we're doing to support children in school this year. One of the things that we have up online is something called greatdebates.org. We have decided to really talk about television and its impact on the presidential race, because of course that couldn't be more timely right now. We're going looking ahead at possibly having three debates online between the two candidates now, and we really talk about television in a way that looks at how it continues to evolve, and as it evolves it really causes disruption with the people who have to utilize this medium. So we look at the great debates by sorting it into about 9 moments of disruption, talking about how the presidents went from television, from radio to television to online, social media, and and how important that is for people to understand and to know about, because television actually not just affects the presidential race, but so many other industries, and its ability to keep evolving again always brings us along with us, and we have to follow. So I'm really pleased. If you go to greatdebates.org, you will not only see a timeline of 100 years of how the presidential elections have intersected with the evolution of television, and then you will also see a number of narratives about presidents along the way and different things. And plus, we have nine modules curriculum for teachers to use. So if you're a parent schooling your kid at home and you want to use this to talk a little bit about politics, it's a great resource for you. And if you are a teacher of middle schoolers to high schoolers, it's also a great resource. It's totally free. It's greatdebates.org. Please come to visit, take a look, and learn a little bit. Now, tonight, we're actually going to talk about children's television. This is an area that it's a real favorite of mine, and I feel really honored to be able to be talking to Jim Engel tonight about children's television. He's actually the curator of children's television at the Museum of Broadcast Communication. Jim, it's so good to see you.
Oh, Susie, it's great to see you too. It's great to see anybody lately. But it's great. To great.
Well, I can't think of anything also more exciting and more interesting to me than children's television in Chicago. It was something I grew up on, as you did, and I know that you already know that I'm a little bit of a geek when it comes to these things. When Jim was putting together the exhibit that we have on children's television, I told him that the biggest fangirl in the world. I said, please, when you take out Garfield Goose, call me. Let me
You know,
watch.
first of all, everybody's a geek when it comes to this. I've spent a lot of time in the museum watching people react to kid show displays, and everybody has the same reaction. It's just joyful. Secondly, what you described with wanting to see and handle the puppets was exactly my feeling the first time I handled them. It was like they were like holy grail artifacts, and they were so significant to me and my childhood that sometimes I really couldn't believe that I was actually arranging these things, setting up displays and stuff like that. And I still feel like that every time I'm in a situation to do that. They're just great. And they are the ones, you go, this is the same one I watched my whole life. This is him. This is Garfield Goose or Romberg Rabbit. So I never tire of it. 2 feet away from me. There's two 11 by 14 canvases, one of Garfield Goose and one of Romberg Rabbit. I love those characters.
Oh, that is so wonderful. I just think it was a genius program. I mean, just totally genius. But we'll go into Garfield in a minute. I want to talk a little bit about how you got into, besides loving children's television, how you got into actually working on children's television and being able to do all that you do with curating
Well,
children's.
yeah, my background, I'm a cartoonist, and I've been a cartoonist my whole life, but I've been a professional cartoonist for almost 45 years. And I think that, and my schooling for that was literally just comic books and cartoons and stuff, and kids TV. There were aspects of the kids shows in Chicago that I really glommed onto from a cartooning and an art standpoint. And so it just, to me, went hand in hand with all my pop culture interests. The only thing about it was that for most of my life, it wasn't documented anywhere. And there was no place like the museum to go to see any of this stuff. So I literally spent most of my life with some TV sections I'd saved when I was a kid, with one or two photos, because there was no internet, so the stuff was not accessible in any way. And those things were treasures to me too, and the Garfield Goose postcard I had, or the Bill Jackson TV sections and stuff. So they were just part of my sort of complete pop culture obsession, and an area that really was a special area for me. And the more I was able to find as a collector and locate and meet people, it just built on what a wonderful thing it is. And I would say that when I think about the museum and the effect it has on people that are interested in these shows, it's exactly that. Because unlike me, who's been trying to track stuff down my whole life, most people haven't. So when they walk in and they see some of this stuff, and they haven't seen it since they literally were a kid, they're floored by it. They're just knocked out. So, so
It
it
is. It's
it just was, no, it's
Go
just
ahead.
a
Go ahead.
natural progression. It just dovetailed perfectly with all my interests and inspiration.
Well, and I know for a little while there before it came, we had not, because we were doing other things. We had SNL up and all sorts of other exciting things going on. We did not have some of the puppets and some of the children's television artifacts that we have up. And we had people coming saying, "Where's Bozo?"
Oh,
We are
sure.
more than just Bozo, but Bozo is really wonderful and important. And
Yeah.
actually, when people think about children's television, Chicago is really a place where a lot of it was formed. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of chauvinism on behalf of on the part of all Chicagoans, because I remember posting on Facebook once that we had the greatest shows, and one of my friends said, "Well, there are people in Cincinnati who might disagree with you," but that's a good thing. I mean, every major market had their beloved character. I'm a huge fan of a show that ran for 35 years in Phoenix called Wallace and Ladmo. So there were some long-running shows around the country, but when TV started, these stations had a lot of time to fill, and they filled it themselves, and people played a lot of different roles. Some people know that Bob Bell, while he was Bozo, was also Andy Starr. He was an off camera announcer. He did a lot of stuff. And in those days, it's kind of like the Wild West of television. People had to play multiple roles, and a lot of times what's cool about a lot of the kids shows and what they call the Chicago School of Television is that just in order to get a new show out every day, they weren't always fully scripted. They had a basic outline, and they relied on the performers to, get the story told one way or another. And a kid shows in between cartoons or short subjects or whatever else they showed. So that's a lot of time to fill. And Chicago came up with some really great, unique shows. And I've collected stuff from around the country in terms of local TV. And yeah, there are some that really stand out. And maybe if I had grown up in those places, I'd be absolutely floored. I remember finding a show called Lucy's Toy Shop. I forget what state it was on. And they used the same theme music as Garfield Goose. And I almost fell out of the chair when I watched the video. I'm like, but that's Garfield Goose. But anyway, Chicago, like all cities, had to come up with a lot of stuff, and they had to be inventive. And what people do in those circumstances is only as good as the people doing it. And I think Chicago had some remarkable people doing it, and as a result, we had some great, long-running, unique shows.
And I think too what comes through on so many of the shows. I even remember this as a kid. Was the laughter that the adults had, the jokes that the adults had between themselves. When you watch the Raynor show, you really, really felt like whatever Ray was doing, especially with Cuddly Dudley, was, there was something you might be missing. There was some joke you might be missing because the adults in back of you were laughing as well. But
Right.
it was just wonderful to see a big dog talking to Ray and giving him the news scoop. Yeah.
And some of those, particularly like Bozo and Ray Raynor, like, it's almost like the band cracking up on the Tonight Show or something in the background, and you got that same kind of vibe off of it. And I also think, like in your example of Cuddly Dudley, the fact that these guys were just filling time any way they wanted to. I'll digress a minute. One of my favorite moments of Cuddly Dudley ever was Raynor was going to have as a guest on his show on a particular day one of these guys that stands in a department store window and he's perfectly still like a mannequin. And he's telling Cuddly Dudley that, oh, Cud, today we've got this guy who comes on and he's like a mannequin. He'll just stand perfectly still and he won't move and you won't believe it. And Roy Brown, who was the puppeteer of Cuddly Dudley, just goes, oh, you mean like this? And he pulls his hand out of the puppet and lets it flop over. And of course, the puppet just lays. And Ray is like, yeah, okay, Cud. So come on, Cud, you want to do the news now? And he just left him hanging. And that's, on local TV. And that's that. As I'm sure you know, there wasn't a lot of national stuff, so that's the other reason everybody had to fill their own time. Yes, there were shows like Howdy Doody.
I'm going to stop you for 1 minute because I don't think people always understand that it didn't start with the national
No.
with the networks. TV started from the ground up. It was organic in different cities, correct?
Right. Right. And so people generally don't know the difference. I've asked people like, what were your kids shows? What were your local kid shows growing up? People who grew up in other states, and they'll say, well, Captain Kangaroo and Sherry Lewis, and I'll say, but those aren't local shows. People don't really know the difference, and they don't really know necessarily that their favorite show in their city was actually only in their city. And so later on, you get a show like Super Circus. Mary Hartline just died. She was on Super Circus, was a local show and very successful. So in that case, the network brought it to New York, but they let everybody in the cast go and replace them all. And Super Circus, was national at that point. But that's not usually the case.
Take us back one step and explain to people exactly what Super Circus was. It was on the vanguard of television, children's television.
Yeah, Super Circus was an early children's TV show. It was filmed here in Chicago, I believe in the old Civic Opera House. And it was a very successful show. Mary Hartline played a kind of like the band leader, and it didn't hurt that she was kind of a knockout blonde in a miniskirt. And people often say that it was a kid show that dads didn't mind watching with their kids. And they had some very good clowns. They had acts, and when Circus might have been traveling through town, they'd get some of those people to come on the show. And so it was a kind of a big production show, and it was very popular. There was a lot of product. Mary Hartline was a spokesman for Canada Dry Ginger Ale. There were comic books. There were the equivalent of little golden books. There were toy play sets and stuff like that. It was a very big early TV success kid show.
And one thing you might not know, Jim, is that you were actually the star of this show last week. Is that we actually played after Mary Hartland died. We played the interview that you did with her at the museum because it was just so wonderful. And I loved the fact that this is somebody who, unfortunately, history can just be buried, right? And Mary Hartline was somebody who I actually never heard of. And was just amazed when she died, reading the obituary, looking at the interview that you did, and we wanted to share that with people so that they could see, who this woman was and how the evolution was in her show and what she did and what Super Circus was. But it was one of the first, right?
Yeah, that was a wonderful afternoon with her, and her whole story would make a great movie. I mean, she started out as a model. She ends up on these shows, and then eventually she was married a few times. She marries the heir to the Woolworth fortune and becomes a socialite in Palm Springs with mansions and yachts everywhere. And then he dies, and he contacted her in 2001 for the museum unveiling of Puppets, Pies, and Prizes, and she came and cut the ribbon and stuff. She was sweet in many ways, but it was sort of Sunset Boulevard. You know what I mean? She still had a platinum hair down to her shoulder. I presume it was a wig, and she was very dignified, and she just reminded you of one of these stories or movies where somebody sort of had their day, but they've maintained that persona, into her 70s and 80s, But that was what made it great, by the way, though. Having people like that, in my view, back at the museum, the best part about it is that so many of them labored in obscurity. So many of them, a lot of them, that kid show thing was just something they did a long time ago. They moved on to other careers, you know, and so many of these people I don't think had a sense of the significance they had. So in 2001, we brought every surviving kid show host back that we could. Some of them were floored that people were out the door and around the block waiting to meet them, and it was so wonderful to see them meet their public after decades and realize the mark that they had left, which I'm absolutely convinced most of them had no sense of at all.
Well, and I think people don't. I'm just amazed at how, because we want the museum to be relevant. We don't necessarily always want to traffic in nostalgia, but nostalgia is so
Yeah.
important, and we forget the impact that television has on children's lives. I mean, the in 2017, there was the MacArthur Foundation went out on a limb with a huge grant that it called out. We called it 100 million plus change, and this was to go to an organization anywhere around the world who could make a difference. And that ended up going to Sesame workshop, as well as the
Hmm.
International Rescue Committee, because it was recognized that to be able to produce a children's television show, Sesame Street, for Syrian refugees was one of the most important things you could do to help these children who were in refugee camps grow up feeling better about life, feeling better about it, because children's television has that type of impact on young minds. And
Oh,
so,
absolutely. But while you say and I know this, we're conscious of not being purveyors completely of nostalgia. But the fact of the matter is that no matter when you come along, there's going to be nostalgia. In the world of comic books, there's this idea of the golden age, which was like the 1940s when comics first got popular. And the comics writer Roy Thomas once coined an expression that I've used a million times since. Because when people talk about television or anything else, what the golden age was, he just said one time, the golden age was when you were 12. And that is the where people have. So while some of the things we have on display at the museum are, at a certain point nostalgia because a lot of people coming in didn't live them, didn't know them, those same people later on will be looking at shows like, um, Pound Puppies or current ones like Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood or something. And they will have that same feeling at a certain point because everybody does. If you are a fan of, what's happening or something, no matter what other people as adults might have thought about it, if you were the right age to be watching it, that's going to be your nostalgia. That's going to be the thing you love and can't believe and like, oh, look at this and see an artifact from it and get blown away by it.
yeah. So I love the way things are set up, and you are a big reason for that. In the museum, when we're talking about children, you can go from Ray Rayner to Bozo to to
You know?
Garfield, and then over to Taylor and Giggle Snort Hotel, and it's a lovely like little travel through there, and you see there was Ray Rayner in the morning, there was Bozo in the afternoon, and there was Garfield Goose in the evening after you came home from school, and you can kind of just flow through. And as you had said earlier, people were also there were people who were actually on the Ray Rayner show, on the Bozo show, and then also on the Garfield show, correct?
You mean like the public or some of the same people? For sure the same
Yeah.
people.
Right,
Yeah,
right, 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 right.
Roy Brown is probably the best example of that because he was the puppet creator and the puppeteer on Garfield Goose. He was Cuddly Dudley on the Ray Rayner show, and then he was Cookie the Clown on Bozo, probably the most beloved clown after Bozo, maybe even more so than Bozo. So, and he was involved in a lot of other shows at the same time. Bob Bell similarly was, as I mentioned, he would turn on Ray Rayner in the morning, and the announcer voice you would hear at the interstitials would be Bob Bell. Bob Bell would also be around for Bozo. Obviously, he was Bozo. And he also played a character that hosted Three Stooges shorts named Andy Starr. But as a kid, there's no way on earth I wouldn't have believed he really was an old man sitting in this dusty theater. When I found out it was Bob Bell, it was really hard to believe. That's how good he was as a playing an older guy. And Ray Rayner did the Ray Rayner show. At one point, Ray Rayner was on the Ray Rayner show. He was on Bozo as Oliver, and then he had an afternoon show called Rocket to Adventure, where he played a spaceman that showed science fiction cartoons. He was also the host of the Tracy Show. So a lot of these guys, and not just WGN, some of the other people, Weatherman played. John Coughlin, who died, I think, in 2001. People remember him as a weatherman, but I remember him first as a guy named Buffalo Nichols on a show called Breakfast House, where he was like an old cowboy hosting a kid's show. So a lot of these guys, even I'm blanking now. The big weatherman on WGN that everybody loves so much, Tom Skilling. Tom Skilling started out in Milwaukee, I believe, and he did the weather at night on the news with a popular puppet from one of their kids' shows in the afternoon named Albert the Alley Cat. And the two of them would perform together until the meteorologists union cracked down on him and said it was undignified to have a puppet interacting with legitimate weather, and they made that stop. But I know I have a lot of friends from Wisconsin, and I remember people who fondly remember that and that character. You could get
I
away with
can
stuff like that maybe up to the 70s, but then
I can't think of any situation in life where it is undignified to have a puppet there. I just really can't.
no.
There's just way. So I would love you to talk a little bit about, you were talking about, the Chicago feeling of pride in terms of our shows. And I want you to talk a little bit about Bozo, because again, Bozo was not unique to Chicago, but yet our Bozo was unique, correct?
Yeah, yes, that's a
Of the
perfect example. The two shows that people get confused about in that regard, when we were talking before about, do people know what's local and do they know what's network? Bozo was a franchise. So Larry Harmon, who was an actor, in fact, he was a kid show host himself, but he bought the rights to Bozo from Capitol Records. Bozo started out as a character on kids' records telling stories. And then he basically franchised it around the country. So he would go to a city. You have to hire a guy to play Bozo. There's a costume. You will get the Bozo cartoons, which Harmon produced and did the voices for, and that can be one of the main features of the show. And then you come up with the rest of your own stuff. So Bell was the most successful in the sense that our Bozo show lasted the longest. But if you watch some of them, it's hard to not argue that it had the best quality for sure too. But then again, if I grew up in Boston and I had a different guy, I might bicker about that. And the other show that was like that was Romper Room, where if you grew up in Chicago, you might have seen one or two so-and-sos during the years you grew up. But other cities also bought the Romper Room franchise, and they hired their own local Miss So-and-so, and she had her own magic mirror at the end of the show, and they had their own, and that show also was designed to sell product because there was Romper Room product you could buy for stuff. So anyway, Bozo, like, so for in the case
Wait
of
a minute,
Chicago,
wait a minute. Did they all say the same romper stomper bumper boo?
yeah, they
Tell
did,
me,
and they
tell
all,
me do.
and there are people in other cities that go, she never said my name. Yeah, they did.
Yeah, for those of you who
But
don't know what we're talking about, whoever the Miss was, I remember Miss Elizabeth. She used to take her mirror at the end of the show, and she would always say, "Romper, stomper, bumper, boo. Tell me, do. Did all my friends have fun today? Did all my friends have fun at play?" Is that correct?
mirror, no, it's tell me magic mirror today. Did all my friends have fun at play? And she had a thing that looked like a mirror, but they
Mhm.
had a spiral they'd zoom in on, and then when they pulled out, the center of the mirror was gone. So she's just basically holding up this lollipop shaped wire thing in front of her face, and then saying who she sees and who's having a special day and stuff like that. So, but now
Yeah,
in
and
that
you
case, no, I was saying in that
go
case,
ahead.
it was primarily her on the various cities. But the other thing that changed, like from Bozo to Bozo, was who the supporting characters were. So in our case in Chicago, you had Sandy, was Don Sandberg, you had Oliver O'Oliver, you had Wizzo, of course, you had Cookie, and there were some other clowns in and out of that. But other
But
cities didn't have those.
would you go back to Wizzo, because I don't think people understand that. Not everybody understands that Wizzo was also a man who was a magician, not a musician.
Yes,
Um,
most
correct?
people around the country, if they never saw Wizzo, knew Marshall Brodeen because he had these omnipresent commercials for TV Magic Cards, which is a product he made, and it
Mhm.
it was a deck of cards that allowed you to do a million different tricks. And so he was on there in a tuxedo, and he'd be like, "I'm Marshall Brodeen, a professional magician, and you can do this, and you can do this, and you can do magic. It's easy." It was his tagline, and everybody, like people all over the country, remember that. And so he started out, well, he was in Chicago. He was in Chicago when he was a sideshow barker at Riverview, and he performed his magic acts in little clubs around town, including he had some great stories about performing for gangsters that wanted to
Mhm.
know how tricks were done. But after appearing on Bozo a number of times as himself as a magician, they got the idea of having him become a regular, and so they created the character Wizzo the Wizard. So it allowed him to be a clown essentially, but also to do magic on a regular basis on the show. And he, people loved him. He's great.
Oh, I remember him so well. I have to say though, he's the one that scared me.
Yeah,
He was
yeah,
he's
a
a
little
little
too
ominous.
close, but the duty. Yeah,
Yeah.
he, he,
Now I'm going to go back to Bozo too, and also say that I'm always surprised at how many people come in and remember them because we forget that Bozo went on for quite some time, right? It didn't go off the
yeah.
air, and it went off in the
Went
70s.
off in 2001. It went on. It was on for
Oh,
40 years.
it was on for 40 years. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was looking at something else, and it also because WGN was a superstation, it went all
Yes,
over. Yeah, so we've had
yeah,
people come in from South America saying, "Where's
right.
donde está Bozo?" Um, so
Uh, and there are people in other cities then who would have seen our bozo in the process too. But yes, that's very very true. And they are on the superstation. Superstation. I remember being in Florida once watching them on TV, and yeah, and it gave them another big boost to their audience. But by the time 2001 rolled around, it seemed like every 5 years maybe there was talk about canceling Bozo, and I think because it was would be such a blow to the city, WGN just never did it. But eventually they found a different way to get rid of it, and they just made it more and more boring and educational to fulfill their educational requirements to the point where you were watching Bozo do exercises. So when they finally killed it off, you had a certain number of people going, "Oh, I love Bozo. It's my favorite show. I can't believe this. I can't believe they're taking it off the air. I didn't know it was still on the air." And so it, it was sort of like a mercy killing, but I think they set it up so that they could get away with it without what seemed like a really awful offense if Bozo had stayed the true Bozo that time all that time.
well, Jim, I'm so thrilled that you are here today to talk, and I know you're going to come back again, aren't you? We're going to talk a little bit more about it. I hope very soon.
Anytime you want, Susie. I love talking about it.
Well,
Yeah.
I love your stories. They're just wonderful. They're magical, and they're a real hint into, television's origins, how what was important, how it began. We think of it in very different ways on the other side of the glass of
Yeah.
TV. So, and you have an insight into it, which is really rare, and your historical depth is phenomenal, and we're so grateful for you.
No,
Well, so this is the end of another happy half hour. Again, my toast to all of you. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully, we'll see you next Tuesday. Bye bye.